Good evening, folks. I thank you for joining us this evening for the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign annual gathering, this year again via Zoom. I'm Beverly Spear, Outreach and Advocacy Director and co-host for tonight's gathering. Co-hosting is our newest staff member, Yuseli Flores, or Sally as we know her. She will be she'll be recording the Q&A portion of the session. Before I hand it over to Matt for the evening's program, we'd like to briefly go over some of the housekeeping logistics. We are recording the session, the entire session. There's some folks that weren't able to join us, so I want to be able to share a link with them. Attendees, you all are in listen-only mode. Only the hosts and the panelists are able to mute or unmute their audio. And one thing we'd like you all, the attendees, to do is to, in the chat box, include your name and where in Wisconsin you reside. So we have a record of that, and you all can see that information. I'm gonna hand it over to Sally to talk about how attendees participate and the difference between chat and the Q&A.
Thanks, Beverly. So in the chat, we just want to have the option to chat with you for any technical issues. But then in the Q&A, we're encouraging everybody to ask questions throughout the session. I'll be keeping stack, and then if it makes sense to answer it on the spot, I will try to ping the speakers, but if not, we'll just move on with the show, and we will try to answer as many questions as we can towards the end. Again, we want to make sure that audio quality is working, so please use the chat box for any more technical issues.
Great, thanks. This is the program for the evening. We're going to have start with Matt, who will talk about democracy on trial. Before I let him get started there, I want to share with you guys that he has a book coming out this fall that he's titled, and it's with the UW Press, titled 12 Ways to Save Democracy in Wisconsin. If you like more details on that, you can be in touch with him directly. So Matt, I'll kick it over to you.
Thanks, Beverly, and thanks everyone for coming to our annual celebration. I'm looking forward to hearing our keynote speakers, Editor Bruce Murphy and State Rep Francesca Hong. But first, I'd like to share some thoughts with you and thank some people who need thanking. I'd like to thank our terrific staff, Beverly, who you just met, who is our Outreach and Advocacy Coordinator. You've seen her before at our annual meetings if you've attended them. Sally, our Racial Equity and Economic Justice Advocate, who you just met. Mike Bulow, our Research Director, who writes a lot of our news posts that you see on our website and our Facebook page, and that you also see in those e-alerts that I send you about once a week. David Julseth, he's our data analyst who codes all the political donations, and he's coded more than 1 million of them, if you can believe that. It's true. Evan Arnold is our development associate. He handles all the gifts that you've been giving us over the years, which we're grateful for. And Barb Kinnear, our financial manager. She keeps our books clean and tidy, which is a good thing. This is a small staff. It's a hardworking staff. It's a great staff. And we all managed to keep pulling our weight during COVID. So I'm very grateful to all of them for doing that. I'd also like to thank the members of our board. And board members are not compensated at all, not even with a sandwich every other month. They do this totally in a volunteer capacity. I want to thank our president, Abby Sweats, our vice president, Bill Franks, our secretary and treasurer, Pete Cannon, Mary Rouse, former dean of students at the UW, Madison Poet Laureate, Angie Trudell Vasquez, Alfonso Zepeda Capistran, who works at DPI and is one of the leaders of the Latino community right here in Madison. And this year, we're delighted to have added 2 new members. Erin Grunzey, formerly head of the League of Women Voters in Wisconsin, and I used to work with Erin when we were both at the Progressive, and Beauregard Patterson of the Pines Bach law firm. Beauregard is partially responsible for that great victory in court recently when Judge Stephen Elke nullified the contracts that Speaker Voss and Majority Leader Lemieux had signed with those expensive lawyers who were billing taxpayers in advance for the rigging of the maps that is yet to come. Nice to get a victory. I also want to salute outgoing board member Sue Lloyd, who actually helped found this organization back in 1995 and has served on our board faithfully ever since. She's a stalwart, as I'm sure you know, but she's decided to step back now, and we're so grateful to her for all that she's given to the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign and to so many other pro-democracy groups here in Madison and across the state over these many, many long years. We're going to miss you, Sue, and thanks again for all your work for us. And last but not least, I'd like to thank every single one of you for all your support to the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign over all these years. We wouldn't be here without you. Now for a few reflections, if I might. Looking back, the last year has been a year to forget. Between the pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, and the subversive actions of Donald Trump, this was the most perilous year for our country since the Cuban Missile Crisis and the assassination of JFK in 1963. In Wisconsin, we've seen the ramifications and heard the reverberations of this year to forget, up close and personal. We witnessed the Republican legislature tie the governor's hands behind his back during the pandemic. We witnessed the shooting of Jacob Blake in the back 7 times, and the failure to charge that cop with anything, not even reckless endangerment. He's back on the beat, by the way. And we saw Trump and his minions trying to overturn our election right here in Wisconsin. We saw 9 fake electors anoint themselves, including Bob Spindell, who is on the Wisconsin Elections Commission of all places. We saw 15 elected officials from Wisconsin begging Vice President Pence not to seek the genuine electors from our state. We saw 3 conservative justices on the Wisconsin Supreme Court say they were perfectly willing to toss out thousands of votes from Wisconsin citizens who cast their ballots according to the instructions they were given by election officials. That's just shameful, absolutely shameful. We saw the now head of the Assembly Committee on Campaigns and Elections, Janet Brandgen, say in December that there's no doubt Donald Trump won the election. And now we see a raft of anti-voter bills circulating in Wisconsin that would make it harder for all of us to vote by absentee ballot and would erect even more barriers for people living in nursing homes or residential care facilities who want to vote. Here's how hideous it's been getting. One bill that was introduced would make it a felony for an employee of a nursing home even to encourage residents to vote, not who to vote for, just to register to vote or just to cast a ballot. That's shameful too. But we've also seen people stand up for our democracy. In response to the murder of George Floyd, there were Black Lives Matter protests in more than 4 dozen Wisconsin communities, many that had never seen a civil rights protest in their lives or in their history of that community. In response to the threats against our elections, the Wisconsin Voting Rights Coalition came together, and we're part of it, to make sure that voters weren't disenfranchised on November 3rd. And now we're making sure that those anti-voter bills don't become law. And in response to the whitewashing of January 6th and the big lie that will not die, former Republican legislators Reed Ribble and Tom Petri recently stood up and signed that open letter to the Republican Party, demanding that the party respect democracy and truth and not follow one man over a cliff. This is a Profiles in Courage moment. So I applaud Liz Cheney, and I applaud Mitt Romney, and I applaud Representative Kinzinger, and I applaud Reed Ribble and Tom Petri. But I wonder where the other Wisconsin Republicans are at this delicate moment. I haven't heard a peep from Paul Ryan. I haven't heard a peep from Scott Walker, and I suppose I never will. I'm not waiting for that. I haven't heard a peep from Robin Voss or Devin Lemieux, and I haven't heard a peep from Tommy Thompson. Their silence at this critical moment for our democracy is damning, because we almost lost our democracy on January 6th, and we could still lose it if we're not vigilant. Democracy is a fragile flower, as we found out so shockingly in this year to forget. But we must not forget this year, ever. And we need to recognize that there are powerful people, very powerful people, who want us to forget this year, or worse, want us to misremember it. The normalizing that's going on about January 6th is almost unbelievable to watch. You may have heard about the representative from Georgia, his name's Andrew Clyde, who called those who stormed the Capitol regular tourists, even though he himself was barricading the door of his office when the rioters were rampaging down the halls. Here's another example, a little bit closer to home. When I was testifying at the State Senate Committee on Elections recently about those anti-voter bills, the author of the bills, Senator Dewey Strobel, was sitting right next to me and was trying to rebut my accusation that he was fueling the big lie. He insisted that Democrats did the same thing in 2016. I hasten to add that Democrats didn't storm the Capitol and yell, "Hang the vice president." My friends, history is being whitewashed right in front of us. It's straight out of Orwell. We're being told not to believe what we saw with our very own eyes. This blatant lying, this wholesale falsification, the cowardice of Republican officials, and the rise of white supremacy, all of these are ominous threats to our democracy that keep me up at night. Now, here at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, we're doing what we've always been doing and a little bit more. We're tracking and exposing big and dark money in our politics, of course. We're filing ethics complaints against both parties when they aren't abiding by even the lax regulations on campaign finance that this state has. We're updating our website with original reporting and commentary. We're getting the word out through the traditional media and on social media. We're giving public talks all across the state, though this year they were all by Zoom, which I learned to get accustomed to. We're testifying also at the state capitol. I testified by Zoom about 4 or 5 times and then in person with that Dewey Strobel encounter. We're also helping to lead the movement to ban gerrymandering in Wisconsin. We had a great rally on Monday at the Capitol. We're helping to lead the movement to curb big and dark money in our politics, as always. We're helping to lead the movement to preserve and expand voting rights, which I've talked about. And we're working, as always, in coalition with other pro-democracy reform groups. But we're also doing more. We're speaking out about the anti-democracy movement in this country. We're underscoring the need for racial equity as a democracy issue. We're also going to court more, filing more lawsuits and amicus briefs with Law Forward, intervening where we can to raise crucial challenges in the courts. And at my urging and with the approval of our board, we recognized that it was vitally important that we expand our staff and hire a racial equity and economic justice advocate. We didn't fill the job right away. Actually, we had a job search and we put it on hold. We were waiting for the right person and we found her. Sally Flores is doing a terrific job for us in this position. She's writing excellent columns for our website on a regular basis. She translates them into Spanish and gets them republished on Spanish language news sites. She's meeting with legislators, including Representative Hong, and she's speaking in public and doing more coalition work for us. As important as banning gerrymandering is, and as important as cleaning up the mess of our campaign finance system is, and as important as defending and expanding voting rights is, it's also crucially important if we are actually to have a real democracy where everyone has an equal voice, that we dismantle white supremacy and move toward economic democracy. So yes, we're advocating now on these big issues too. It's time. It's past time. And thanks to you, we can do all of this work, and we enjoy doing all this work. So I want to thank you again for all of your support. And I'm happy to report that our finances are secure, again, thanks to you. And I pledge to you in the year ahead that we'll do all we can to promote democracy here in Wisconsin and to ring the alarms about the anti-democracy movement that is afoot here in Wisconsin and around the country. My friends, it's an old fight we're all in. This fight for democracy, this fight against the forces of reaction. But together, with your support, I'm confident that we'll prevail. Thank you for listening, and let's get on with the program now and with the keynote speakers. That was just a little bit of an appetizer. So Bruce Murphy is the editor of Urban Milwaukee and the chief columnist there. Before that, he served for 7 years as editor of Milwaukee Magazine and 3 years as a senior enterprise reporter for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. An online innovator, Bruce Murphy was the co-founder of the website MilwaukeeWorld.com, and early in his career, he forged a path in alternative weeklies as editor of the upstart Metro Milwaukee Weekly in the late 90s, and later as editor of the Shepherd Express. And some of you may remember his byline from Isthmus back in the mid-1980s when I was writing there too. Bruce Murphy has won more than 30 national and state writing awards. He was the guy who broke the Milwaukee County pension scandal, which resulted in the county exec and 7 county supervisors being tossed out of office, the biggest political scandal in Milwaukee's history. Bruce and I regularly bounce our stories off each other, and I share his on our social media, and he shares ours at Urban Milwaukee. I enjoy and really appreciate this camaraderie. So I'm pleased to introduce to you Bruce Murphy.
Thank you. It's funny you mentioned that about the old days at Isthmus. I remember you did some stories for Isthmus. I was arts and entertainment editor for Isthmus at that point in the mid 80s. And then years later, we were looking for an editor at Milwaukee Magazine, and I contacted Matt to ask if he had any interest. He had no interest, none. I think it was a wise decision on his part. It probably wouldn't have been a good fit. But when he asked me to speak to this group, I was honored to do it because I've always had a high regard for the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, all the more so under Matt's leadership. And I have several reasons I'll talk about here, but the most simple and selfish one is it makes a lot less work for reporters like me. Let me just take you back to what things were like in the bad old days in terms of campaign donations. This was back before Twitter, back before Facebook, back before the internet, back before I had a gray beard, way long ago. And back when campaign donations filings were actually done by hand. Seriously, that's how it worked. And so you'd have these handwritten piles of documents. And I was working on a feature story for Milwaukee Magazine. This was 1990 on the race for governor. And that was the two Toms, Tommy Thompson versus Tom Loftus. And Thompson was the incumbent Republican and running for re-election, and he had tons of campaign donors, which I had to go through. And the pile of handwritten documents was about a foot high, and if not higher, and it was page after page after page, which I had to, it took endless hours of work to go through this and figure out the campaign donations. So that's how things worked back then. And the pure drudgery involved in going through those documents meant that campaigns were not really very transparent. So then came the beginning of the internet, some of these early websites, and at some point in 1995, the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign was founded, and it soon did all the dirty work and made all this information available for the first time by candidate, by donor. I mean, that was a revolution. Suddenly, reporters had access to this information quickly that they could reference in their stories. Now, it's true that at some point, the campaign finance forms became computerized. The Wisconsin Ethics Commission would have this information. But it still takes a lot of work to wade through their files. And I've never used it. I always use Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. And my guess is that every other reporter in the state probably does the same, but just for the heck of it, I checked with some other reporters to see what they had to say. Eric Gunn at the Wisconsin Examiner said this: "Last year I did a piece about the Jobs First Coalition, started by Scott Jensen, and its dark money work, and the WDC was central to the hard data in that story. Yes, I could have taken the time to go through the Wisconsin Ethics Commission's records myself, I suppose, but that would have been a lot more time consuming. Dan Bice, the political columnist at the Journal Sentinel, said this: "I'm a big fan. The group's database of campaign donors is much easier to search than the state's. Matt is very helpful too. He understands what I need on just about anything." You'll have to talk about that at some point, Matt, if you're that knowledgeable about Dan Bice's needs. Steve Walters, the longtime Capitol reporter who recently retired as the editor of Wisconsin Eye, but still does a fine weekly column for Urban Milwaukee, said this: "Very valuable data compiled by Democracy Campaign, saves reporters hours. Never had anyone from either party say their numbers are wrong." And then he added this: "I just use their numbers and not their rhetoric."
That hurts.
I thought that was pretty funny because the quote rhetoric of the WDC, I mean, the WDC is often assailed by Republicans who say it's a pro-democratic group. And it is, but it's a small d pro-democratic group. And that's a big difference. To take one example, the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign has pushed for replacing gerrymandering with nonpartisan redistricting, which would prevent both parties from gerrymandering. Now, I remember when the WDC was formed and it had a board made up of Democrats and Republicans, which may still be the case today. I haven't really paid attention. But the point is, it was founded to be nonpartisan, and back in those days, the Democrats still controlled the legislature and probably got more of the campaign donations to lawmakers. And Democrat Jim Doyle would go on to win 2 terms as governor while raising huge reams of money. I mean, the Republicans would complain that Jim Doyle has more money than God, which if so, all I can say is they have even more money than that now. But in any event, in those days, the Democrats would grumble about the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. Democratic consultant Bill Christopherson, who ran many statewide campaigns for Democrats, would complain about groups like the WDC, and his word for them was they were the goo-goos, the good government groups. And sort of mock their idealism and impracticality compared to a guy like him. But in more recent years, it's the Republicans who complain more about the WDC, and those complaints now, to my shock, at some point, they started to label the League of Women Voters a Democratic group. I mean, they're all in this together now. And of course, the Republicans happen to be raising most of the money now, and so they're more likely to complain. But not always the case. Democrats raised more money for the state school superintendent race this spring, and the WDC was there to document the data. At Urban Milwaukee, we have such confidence in the WDC reports that we publish them as stories, rather than taking the data and doing our own report. We just cut out the middleman. One of the most recent ones was the final report on campaign spending by the group Scott Walker created for his failed presidential run. Leave it to Matt and the WDC to be on top of that data. Frankly, I'd forgotten all about it, as I suspect our readers had, but it made for a good story and again, served the cause of transparency and democracy. As important as the WDC is, it has become even more important in the years since the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision, which opened the floodgates to corporate spending on elections. The amount of money being spent is truly obscene. We have never been more in need of transparency regarding campaign spending, and the WDC has never been more important. From a small d Democratic perspective, the WDC has been on the right side of many issues, opposing legislation to make it harder to vote, pushing to require more disclosure of dark money donations and other campaign finance reforms, supporting recusal by Supreme Court justices when a case involves large donors to their campaign, and pushing for stronger open meeting laws. Actually, it sometimes occurred to me that the WDC should change the D in its logo to a small d, just to emphasize what it stands for. But however they market themselves, I think it's fair to say we would have less democracy and less transparency in the state without the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. And it is a group that is truly worth supporting. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. That was really sweet of you to say. As for Daniel Bice, I just feed him quotes whenever he needs a quote. You know, that's my, that's how
I thought you were, maybe delivering a case of wine or,
No, my whole approach to reporters is make their jobs easier. If I can get back to them quickly with a quote, it makes them happy and gets their story filed faster, and we can continue to provide information to them. So that's my dealings with Dan. But
well, and that's what reporters love.
yeah, I just, I think sometimes people in nonprofit groups and advocacy groups have an adversary relationship or approach to reporters. And I think if they just get in the reporter's shoes and recognize that reporters are super busy, they got a lot going on. It's hard for them to, get their stories in on time when people aren't returning their calls or giving quotes that they can use. If we can just help them out, then we're doing them a service, we're doing ourselves a service, and keeping that relationship going helps everybody involved. Anyway, it's worked for me over the years. So, well, I want to get on to our next speaker, who is State Representative Francesca Hong. State Rep Hong, as she refers to herself. Francesca Hong is a second-generation Wisconsinite, mother, community organizer, and service industry worker in Madison, Wisconsin. She's the daughter of Korean immigrants and served her community over the years in the hospitality industry, doing nonprofit work and in her community activism. My son, by the way, who's worked in the restaurant industry in Madison for years, tells me she's one of the best chefs in town. She also happened to be a great soccer player, and my daughter played soccer with her and her sister at Madison West. So we have a little connection there. Elected in 2020 as the representative for the 76th Assembly District, State Rep Hong's understanding of the struggles of working class people and their families contributes to her ongoing commitment to creating social, racial, and economic justice. She also, let me add, has a radio show on 92.7 Devil Radio in Madison, which airs on Saturday mornings from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. It's a great show. I highly recommend it. And I highly recommend State Representative Francesca Hong to you. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that very lovely introduction. I remember playing soccer with Catherine, and that was very nice of your son to say. Thank you so much to Beverly and Sally, and very nice to meet you, Bruce. Everyone, my name is Francesca Hong. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm currently in the capital, so I am on occupied ancestral and contemporary Ho-Chunk land, and very, very excited to share space with you all today. I knew Matt before the Wisconsin, I knew about WDC, and I'm a little embarrassed by that. And how I got to know the WDC was because of Sally. Earlier this past year, Representative Christina Shelton and I, who's from the 90th district up in Green Bay, we introduced the Economic Justice Bill of Rights. And, for us, we knew that passing this Bill of Rights was going to be a long shot. A lot of things are quite difficult in this building. Oftentimes I refer to it not as a building of democracy, but more of complacency and obstruction. But we'll get into that later. So we introduced this Economic Justice Bill of Rights, and for us, it was about really setting a stage for our commitment to the people of Wisconsin, knowing that there was it would be so difficult for us to get legislation passed in this building, but we knew that we needed to commit to the grassroots organizations, the people who were engaging their communities about what was going on in the state legislature, that we needed to be, commit ourselves to that work and to really being a megaphone for those organizers. And so we introduced the Economic Justice Bill of Rights as, to document the most basic principles that every Wisconsinite has a right to clean water, to a union, affordable, accessible, high quality healthcare, to live free of injustice, of racial inequality, that everyone have access to reliable, high quality education. And so we introduced this. There was a press conference. We had an op-ed, and Sally responded. And what she did was it was an appreciation for the document, but it again, in order to. She made sure that we weren't just talking the talk. She wanted to make sure that we knew, and I'm so glad that she wrote this op-ed about it, was that, we can't commit to racial justice, social justice, to economic justice without bringing people along with us. And what does that look like? We needed to make sure we were reaching out to all of our communities, specifically the fact that, we didn't have this available in multiple languages. We didn't, really address some of the barriers that exist in communities to be able to access information. And oftentimes so much of government is gatekeeping information from people. And so it was through that not only did we get to meet Sally, but I got to know the important work that the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign was doing. And so I'm really grateful that this organization has committed itself to racial justice and is doing more than just talking that talk, that with with Sally being a part of your organization, she really is holding elected officials like me accountable. And that is so important right now, because we've got folks in here who are throwing around co-opting language, really. We've got Republicans who are co-opting language and using words like accountability and transparency when it comes to elections. I mean, it is wild how the messaging right now, the fight for messaging, we can't seem to keep up, and it's a problem. Policy-wise, things are very ineffective, and we know that it's because we have obstructionist Republicans who basically are working more towards fascism than democracy. I want to talk a little bit about this trajectory of what it's like in here. And when Matt asked me first, one word comes to mind, and it's absurdity. We started with a Dear Leader campaign to Robin Vos, a resolution celebrating his resiliency and his service before we passed COVID relief. So we started with that. In the middle, there was a Rush Limbaugh resolution. There was, continued obstruction, and when we tried to get rid of the 1-week waiting period for unemployment, when we tried to get aid to folks, when we tried to get hazard pay and paid leave for workers, people who during the pandemic had not been protected, but yet still came to work, unlike many of my colleagues. So to go from that and then to not pass Black History Month resolution because it included individuals like Stacey Abrams and Kamala Harris, that was the reason that was overly politicizing their games. They get to pick and choose who gets to play, and they rig the game themselves. And then to go from Voss's Speaker Voss's speech and celebration to not passing Black History Month resolution or COVID relief, meaningful COVID relief. I think a lot of the legislation we pass is relatively anemic, to a Rush Limbaugh resolution. And then just last session, we introduced and passed in the Assembly a bill that would require the singing or playing of the national anthem prior to sporting events that were held in partially publicly funded stadiums and games. And that's what I'm referring to when I'm talking about absurdity, and the fact that there's more complacency in this building than there is democracy. And it is frustrating, and it is exhausting, and not to mention incredibly racist. But we have to keep fighting. And we know we keep fighting because we know that there are folks out there, folks on this call, folks like Matt and Sally and Bev and Bruce, who are doing the work to recognize and really not just sound the alarm bells about the realities of what's happening in this building, but to know that through people power, we can fight back. So we've got some issues in terms of messaging, absolutely. And I don't think it's cohesive enough. And I don't think it's truth-telling enough that, you know, the problem really is the fact that they can continue to stoke a base through lies. And I think there are communication failures within different structures of our government right now. And we really, I think we've had an inability to be radical on issues that matter to the majority of Wisconsinites. You know, I'm going back to Matt's speech the other day at the Fair Maps rally, that it is because of gerrymandering that we cannot pass a $15 minimum wage. It is because of gerrymandering that we cannot expand badger care. It is because of gerrymandering that we have complacency as opposed to a democracy, because both Democrats and Republicans are not held accountable. And they can continue to be in their seats and not have to answer to anyone. And it is not representative of the people, and it is not representative of the communities that continue to have to fight for crumbs because of it. Resources, we have to continue to push this message that we shouldn't, there can be more of the pie, right? That the resources that we're seeing that are scarce for folks right now, housing, we have doesn't matter where you live, if it's rural or urban, we have a crisis in housing. It doesn't matter if it's rural or urban, we've got a crisis when it comes to wages that are livable, family supporting wages. These are crises that our leaders are choosing not to address because of gerrymandering. Because again, this is not, it is not a representative democracy right now. It is pure complacency. So how are we going to fix this? How do we make sure that we don't forget everything that has been exacerbated and shown in the past year? I think we need to make sure that we don't talk about just bouncing back or a new normal. We deserve a better normal. We deserve a democracy that is reflective of the people, that is multiracial, ethnic, and multi-generational, that we know that encompassing diversity is our strength, is our power, and should absolutely belong to the people. And I think we should also be focusing on our intent as Democrats to really build infrastructure that's badly needed, right? That we know that care is infrastructure, that healthcare is infrastructure, that equity is infrastructure. And how do we do that? Again, it's messaging. It's communication infrastructure that we also need to build, both within the Capitol and outside of the Capitol. I have to applaud, I think this past budget session is delusional as some of the leadership on the Joint Finance Committee have been. It's almost traumatic to remember. I don't know if if y'all watched that video of what happened with Senator LaTanya Johnson, essentially being told that the Black community experience, that the Black experience could be equated to a glass box on the 3rd floor in the Capitol. That instead of funding the Black Historical Society, let's just say it's enough to have that display up in the Capitol. I mean, there is a blatant disregard for lives. There is a blatant disregard to see people of color as humans by some of my colleagues. And it is impacting policy and it is impacting lives. And honestly, if we do not continue to work to save democracy, these people will kill them. These people will continue to promote policy that will end up with lives lost. And it is imperative that we continue to push and the truth that saving democracy, that getting rid of gerrymandering, this is absolutely racial justice. This is absolutely economic justice, and that we have to continue to push that. I think, you know, one of the problems I saw, and as a newbie to the legislature, you know, I want us to be able to say what people think. I want us to be able to really push that, you know, it's the Democratic small d, it's the Dems messaging that we are on the side of Main Street businesses. We can also be on the side of workers. You know, I'm an example of that. As a small business owner, I know that my investment in workers is what is key to my success. The reasons that I truly believe that I don't have I'm not facing the crises that some of these other business owners seem to think is because of, unemployment benefits. There is no proof that enhanced benefits are keeping people from going to find work. There is zero evidence that we are, some business owners think that they are competing with a couch, that this is where people staying at home, they're choosing to do that as opposed to work. That's ignoring the dignity, and it's insulting to Wisconsin workers, and they're getting away with it because they don't have to be held accountable to anyone. But going back to the small business and the workers, there are gaps, there are bridges that we can close. We know that being pro-worker can also mean pro-business. We know that if we make investment in people and workers, and that they have a right to collectively bargain, that they are able to fight for living wages, that money, it is strengthening the local economy when you have higher wages, because guess what? That money gets spent in the local economy. We know that, especially in the service industry sector too, some of our best customers are service industry workers. They're literally cycling that money back into our small businesses. And so we, have created, and we know that strengthening individual communities is really another way to make these investments in our local economies. We've got folks who, we switched to a $15 minimum wage and eliminated tipping. And we know that that isn't for every small restaurant, but we know that, like many other sectors, like many other industries, the restaurant industry is inherently rooted in a system of white supremacy. And where tipping comes from is one that is, we have to remember that is deeply rooted in slavery. So I think if we're going to start making transformational changes to achieve a better democracy, we have to make investments in people, and we have to see people with dignity and treat them with dignity. And in order to do that, we also have to make sure that we are electing people who are going to be representative of working folks, and folks who don't always have a voice. I also want to make sure that when I talk about multi-generational, that we have to look to our youth and our young leaders right now, and folks who have really just lived through crisis after crisis and have shown resiliency that I think is unmatched. When I look at who was grieving and protesting, because I think, protest is absolutely a way to show grief. When we saw the Black Lives Matter movements and we saw the protests, they continued to march because they knew that they deserved better, that our communities absolutely deserve better. And when I look at who's organizing, how they're organizing, how, there's creativity is not stifled in whatsoever, that they continue to show up and they continue to support, and recognize that it takes emotional labor and physical labor to organize. We have to be supportive of that work. We have to allow youth to unapologetically lead, because I look to youth leaders and youth organizers, and when I need to figure out what actions to take. Again, it's very difficult for me to pass legislation in this building. I'm very proud of the fact that we were able to push some resolutions through. For the first time in Wisconsin state history, we recognized Asian Pacific Islander as the American Heritage Month. But I was also incredibly sad that we were able to pass that resolution and we couldn't pass Black History Month resolution. That again, this is white supremacy at work, pitting our communities against one another. I was, very excited to introduce the Hmong Migration Education Act, which was introduced last session by Representative Katrina Shanklin and Representative Pat Snyder. It's a very important addition to Act 31 that pushes for curriculum, that requires curriculum to include human relations between and history for Black Americans, Indigenous folks, Latin Americans, the Latino history as well. But it excluded Hmong Americans and Asian Americans intentionally, because at that time in the late 80s, there was a lot of anti-Hmong sentiment. And so we are reintroducing that legislation to include Hmong Americans and APIDA. It's got strong bipartisan support and we're very excited about it. However, again, we are told that most likely it's going to be stalled in the Education Committee. So there are, we're facing a lot of uphill battles, but we know that none of this work to achieve a better democracy that is multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational, and reflective of the people and what they want. That work doesn't happen with just me or just organizations with Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. This work happens with organizers, and organizers of all different backgrounds, organizers of all different ages. Doesn't matter what you look like, who you are. We need to continue to organize because it is through people-powered movements that legislation is going to pass, that there's going to be cultural mindsets and shifts, and we need all of that to happen. And so let's not just talk about a new normal. Let's not just talk about bouncing back. We deserve better, every single one of us. We all deserve a better normal, and I think we all want to be a part of achieving that. So that's about it for now. I think we're going to have questions, but that's all I got right now.
Well, thanks very much, Representative Hong, for that kind of tour of the Capitol, and also for, echoing, I think, a lot of messages that we need to hear. Some of us have heard from mentors of ours like Howard Zinn, who wrote A People's History of the United States, and he would always talk about the need for grassroots organizations and the need to honor young people and put young people forward. And I just think those messages are so important. And also that movement building and grassroots organizing, as much as working through established organizations like ours, all of this together is what we need. It's not, as you put it, the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign is not going to do it by ourselves. We don't want to do it by ourselves. We don't work by ourselves. It's why we work in coalition, and no single individual can get it done either. And it's important that we are all working together. And I've got to say, you're an inspiring leader for all of us in the Capitol, and I admire what you're doing, and look forward to what you have coming for all of us in your years ahead in that office. So it's great to have you there. I do want to encourage everyone who is on this Zoom to put your questions in the Q&A if you have them, and we will, rather than in the chat, because it's easier for us to work that way. But I wanted to see if Bruce had any questions for Representative Hong or for me, and we can kick it off that way. You're muted too, I think, Bruce.
I don't have any questions, so maybe it's good I was muted.
Okay, good. Well, we will try.
Yeah.
Sally, do we have questions in the Q&A or chat?
We do. We have one question. Given what we just were discussing about the reinstating the job search requirement for those that are unemployed, there was a question asked that reads, what is likely to happen with the Republican effort to reinstate the job search requirement, considering that the current waiver will expire in July?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so when we were looking into this, it's not something that they have to pass legislatively. I think they are trying to push this through a rules change, which the governor and the DWD would be able to essentially respond and continue to extend the waiver. So there's going to be, it's not litigation, it's going to kind of go back and forth in that way is what I expect. But we're continuing to push and demand that both the governor and DWD block that change as they can, but there's a good chance it's going to end up in litigation.
Thank you. If the person that asked the question has to follow up, please make that in the chat. We have one more question as well. Any thoughts on the possibility of passing ranked choice voting, from Jim Goodman?
So there are a couple two different pieces of legislation went through. One was from Senator Larson's and Rep. Spritzer's office, as well as a bipartisan legislation that went through from Rep. Reamer and I believe President, Matt, back me up here. What's his name?
From the Senator Roth? No.
Not Roth, not Lemahue,
Steineke?
the main speaker. Oh, I can see his face right now. Anyway, so there's a bipartisan one as well. And I haven't seen, I believe they're both in committee. And so if they leave committee and they come to the floor for a vote, I think there's a good chance that it could go through. But at this time, I believe that legislation is still in committee.
Thank you, Representative Hong.
Mhm.
Bob did, oh, there it is. Bob did ask a question, and this is for other panelists as well that who can chime in. His question reads, you used the term fascism to describe the authoritarian trends afoot. What do you mean by that term, and should it be used more widely to draw attention to the stakes?
So I hesitate sometimes to use the term only because they've already co-opted it in a way that, you know, Representative Kurtz said, I'd been called this, I'd been called this, I'd been called this, and I'm still going to rise above, because I mean, he cried about it, which was interesting, to push that this was not forced patriotism, that this was a way to unify the country and the state. And so I use it sparingly only because I know that it can be weaponized as well. And especially when I hear my colleagues talk about unity and then completely disregard racial disparities and the realities of certain communities, it gets, you know, then I hesitate to use it again. But in terms of, you know, an authoritarian state, I think that's definitely something that we need to be very conscious of when it comes to the actions of some leadership in here. Again, I cannot believe that it felt like it felt very rehearsed when I think back to that initial floor speech and that resolution that passed for the speaker. I was shocked, and I felt very much like this is, you know, I think it was after January 6th. And so to go from, you know, the insurrectionist and the attack on the Capitol and our democracy to be an elected official in the presence of what felt very much like a dear leader speech, I don't hesitate to use authoritarianism there, because that's what it was.
And I've been, you know, for 30 years, I didn't use the F word in public, the fascism word, when I was at the Progressive, and people were saying we're already living in a fascist state. And, you know, we're not in a fascist state right now yet, because we'd be arrested and thrown in jail right now. But that there is a fascist movement out there, that Trump had all sorts of fascist colorations, that he represents a fascist threat, that what we saw on January 6th was a kind of an old German beer hall putsch. I mean, I think that all of that is undeniable. I mean, fascism is, let's look at the calling cards of fascism. It's racism, it's authoritarianism, it's ultranationalism, and it's a total rejection of liberalism. It's not like these folks don't like Democrats. They don't like democracy. And they hate liberalism. That's the essence of what fascism is. And when you see that white supremacist mob storming the Capitol, when you see that huge Confederate flag in the middle of the Capitol rotunda, when you saw Nazi flags flying in Charlottesville, I mean, to me, that's not a stretch. And I think, so as people who've been at other Wisconsin Democracy Campaign annual celebrations over the last couple of years know, I've been throwing around the F word more and more over the last 4 years, because I do think this is the threat that we face right now in the United States. Are we going to survive as a democracy, or in 2024, or who knows when, are we going to lose our democracy? And I've recommended this book before to people, How Democracies Die, by two Harvard professors, which goes into other countries falling from a democracy really quickly. And we were a couple of hours from losing our democracy on January 6th. And so, what would have happened if the rioters had grabbed legislators or killed legislators, and then if there was rioting by pro-Biden folks in the streets, and Trump would have called out the military and declared martial law under the Insurrection Act and canceled the Electoral College vote and say, I'm president. I mean, there were people in the Oval Office urging him to do that in the week before January 6th. So I do think Trump is a fascist, and although he's not, he hasn't, written Mein Kampf. I mean, the only thing he's written is a bunch of bad checks, evidently, which may catch up with him. But what worries me is not only Trump, because I think he's going to be too entangled legally by 2024, but the Trump followers, the Trump enablers, the Trump movement, the marriage of the large parts of the Republican majority with this white supremacist movement, and that there'll be other people coming down the pike who will appeal to that mass base. And remember, fascism is a mass-based movement. Unlike authoritarianism, where you can just have a few generals overthrow a government and run a junta, fascism requires a mass base, and Trump built this mass base. 70% of Republicans still believe the big lie. I mean, that is shocking. That's 50 million people. And so there's that mass base there, and maybe it'll be someone like Governor DeSantis of Florida, or maybe someone else who will lead this anti-democracy movement. But I don't think it's a stretch to call them fascists. It may be counterproductive sometimes in some places rhetorically, because it's such a loud word and turns people off and suggests that you're just doing name calling like they're doing name calling. But I do think it's the closest approximation to an accurate label politically of what we've been seeing.
Bruce, I don't know if you wanted to chime in, but we do have a couple other questions.
Go ahead.
All right. There was two that I'm going to try to put together because they're all in relation to gerrymandering. So the first one was if there was any outlook on a positive site for fair maps in Wisconsin. And then Aaron Grunz asked, because of gerrymandering, many Wisconsin voters have been unable to be heard by their legislators. And in turn, the majority of voters are being shut out on issues that have popular statewide support. What do you suggest voters do to register their concerns? And in particular, this question would like to be answered by Bruce Murphy's perspective as well as Representative Hong's.
Well, as far as Jeremy, you want to go first?
Oh, no, go ahead.
As far as gerrymandering, I mean, I think the next thing that's going to happen is I'm guessing that the Republicans will try to pass this joint resolution that it doesn't require a governor's signature, and hope that the state Supreme Court will uphold that. That's sort of widely assumed. Nobody knows for sure, but that's something that the state Supreme Court struck down as unconstitutional back in the 1960s. And so there's a clear precedent there that it is not constitutional. The question is, how will this court rule? And I very much fear it may get down to Justice Hagedorn, who seems to be the key guy with any of these decisions. And if he upholds the law, as he says is his philosophy, then I would hope he would strike it down. As far as, what people can do, I mean, I think, contacting your representatives is always a good thing to do. The problem, of course, is because the districts are gerrymandered, you're very likely contacting someone who already agrees with you. And the only other thing I would say about all this is, while I think that the gerrymandering definitely is a key factor in why a lot of popular legislation is not getting passed, the other issue is, frankly, the breakdown of the media, the breakdown in the idea of news that we can all trust, and the sort of we're turning into these silos of either liberal or conservative media, and that's really caused a huge problem in terms of what do people trust, what do people believe, and it really is, it's a very disturbing trend.
Yeah, I would agree with what Bruce said, especially I do think it's going to come down to Hagedorn. I think it's going to come down to his decision on whether or not he's gonna uphold that law or not. In terms of what folks can do, reaching out to representatives, but think disruption, 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 especially folks who are in districts that have Republican representation. If you've got family out there, we need to make sure that the organizing that's happening in more rural areas, that we continue to disrupt. And I'm talking, I'm not, I think it's important that, we know the power of mass movements, and it's really difficult to implement at this time. But I think as we're seeing some restrictions being lifted on COVID, to really show up at offices if you can, continue to make folks have to answer their phones. Unfortunately, the representatives that you may be reaching out to, I think regardless if he or she is your representative, to continue to call them, to continue to flood their offices with information and testimony. But we got to show up, and legislators in this building need to show up too, not just in this building, but we do need to meet people where they are. And so our office is absolutely dedicated to talking to more rural voters, using social media, and really making sure that we understand that it isn't just urban or people of color that have been left behind by the state legislature. Rural voters have been left behind too. Like I said, there's a housing crisis in urban areas and rural areas. And I think it's really important that legislators like me in more urban areas go out to talk to folks, that we have conversations. I'm fortunate to have the hospitality industry really as a way to kind of bridge me to other communities, that we can talk about, at a dive bar, we can talk about the issues that matter. And I think it's really important to empower folks, and let them talk about their issues to you. Always legislators need to be better at listeners, always. Like, that is something we need to improve on every single day. And so it's absolutely continue to disrupt, continue to push your legislators, give them action items, tell them to go show up and meet other folks where they are at, and make sure to keep fostering conversations to let them know the reason that things are so hard for folks across this state is because we have legislators who do not have to answer to them. And so let's change that. Let's change that together.
Thank you. Matt, I don't know if you want to chime in. I can continue asking questions.
I'm busily taking notes on what Representative Hong just said. We can take another question.
Okay. This one reads, what, if any, penalties are there for Spindle's election commission misdeeds?
There's nothing. I mean, it looks like actually he is going to be the chair of that commission soon. He's a member on the commission now, and it looks like soon he's going to be chair of the Wisconsin Elections Commission. I mean, how crazy is that here is a guy who pretended to be an elector, was an imposter or fraudulent elector. And we filed a complaint with the Ethics Commission, with Law Forward as our advocate on this, just saying that this is outrageous. But I don't think anything's going to come from it. And I think he's going to be there. I mean, the problem with the Wisconsin Ethics Commission and Wisconsin Elections Commission is that these were creations of the legislature when they destroyed the Government Accountability Board back in 2015, which the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign and the League of Women Voters and a lot of other groups had worked hard to get passed so that we would have an impartial body that overlooks elections and ethics and enforces, not overlooks, but enforces the law on ethics and elections. And now the legislature created this commission, these commissions that are super partisan, with 3 super partisan people on each side, and each side is able to completely block what the other side wants to get done. And we've seen that it's pretty dysfunctional. So I don't think in the short term there's anything we can do about Spindell other than you can write letters to the editor, you can raise the issue in the newspapers and on social media, but it's an outrage.
Thank you. This is a COVID-related question. Cindy Carter says, I'm concerned with the Dems pushing for a vaccine passport. She's afraid that the Republicans will take this and turn it into an evil, more like voters' restrictions. Do you have any thoughts on vaccine passports?
This is a great question. I personally am not a proponent of vaccine passports, but I know that I have many colleagues who get to pick and choose which mandates they want to apply. So, we saw with the bill for the singing or playing of the national anthem that is essentially a mandate that can be implemented, but clearly the mask mandate was not. So I think what's important is to allow public and private institutions to have the flexibility to implement their own vaccine or non-vaccine requirements, that they have that flexibility to put up those policies. I do worry that, we Democrats don't have a great history when it comes to mandates. And so the vaccine passport could lead to some more detrimental messaging. But again, I think it's important to recognize that, my colleagues across, I can't believe they're my colleagues, but there are, many Republicans are pro-business and pro-autonomy for those businesses. And so if they want to continue that message of being on message of having institutions and businesses to have that autonomy, I think they should absolutely allow them to freely implement vaccine passports if they want, but that I don't think that should be a mandate coming from the state. And I know for public institutions that they are not always able to implement those policies without support from the state. Again, there are other ways you can incentivize people to consider public health. And I think the strategy, at least at the University Wisconsin system, that they continue testing is actually incentivizing students to get vaccines because they don't want to continue to have to test every week. So there are ways that you can really, promote good public health policy without having it to be a full, using vaccine passports to kind of trigger folks, if you will.
Thank you. We have another question from John. It reads, shouldn't we be able to find out what marching instructions for drawing the maps as Speaker Voss is giving to law firms drawing them for the Republicans? And this is a follow-up to his comment saying that Republicans often say they must draw district maps because it's a responsibility of the legislature. But beyond that, Democrats have no input, so it's only Republicans anyway. Shouldn't our response be Republicans legislators don't actually draw them now? They have specialized law firms to do it for them.
Right. Certainly, let me just take a quick shot at this. This is one of the counter arguments that we hear from Republicans, that the Constitution says they have to draw the maps. The state constitution does not say that. It says the legislature must apportion anew every time there's a new census. That doesn't mean they have to draw the maps themselves. Last time around, they flew in a political scientist from Oklahoma, of all places, to with all his political software to draw the maps for them, and he drew 9 different incarnations of the maps. And they took one of the most aggressive ones, and rammed it through. So that's not a really kosher argument. Yes, we should be able to see maybe not what they're telling their lawyers, because they may have lawyer-client privilege with that, but whenever they're drawing the maps, whenever Voss and Lemieux and the Republicans are drawing the maps, that process should be done in public, in sunlight, with public participation and input. And that's actually what the People's Maps Commission has been doing so well. It's taken public comment in all the congressional districts. It's taken public comment on its website. It's very transparent in the criteria that it's using to draw the maps. It published it up on its website, and you can go see it there. And the Republicans, by contrast, in 2011, how did they draw the maps? They flew the guy in from Oklahoma. They didn't draw him in the Capitol. They went across the street into the Glass Bank, into the cushy law offices of Michael Best and Friedrich. They drew the maps in a room that was called the map room, and the map room was a locked map room, and the media wasn't allowed in, the public wasn't allowed in, Democrats weren't allowed in. Even Republicans who weren't in leadership had to be led in by the young male clerks of or assistants of the speaker who held the keys. And once they were in the locked map room, they had to look only at their own gerrymandered district. And before they could leave the locked map room, they had to sign an oath of secrecy. I mean, that is the opposite that's 180 degrees of how democracy is supposed to operate. And so we should be able to hear and see how the maps are being drawn and what the criteria are for the drawing of the maps. And is the criteria simply to expand the Republican majority? I'm sure that's what Voss and Lemieux's sole criterion is, but there should be independent, nonpartisan, neutral criteria being used to draw these maps. That's why I like some of the stuff that the People's Maps Commission has been doing and the process by which they're doing it. That's a model. And the bill that was introduced on Monday would require independent, nonpartisan redistricting by the Legislative Reference Bureau. This is a bill that was introduced by Senator Jeff Smith and Representative Deb Indraka, with a lot of representatives, including Representative Hong there on the Capitol steps behind us at the press conference supporting it. And it already has 2 Republican co-sponsors already, Todd Novak of Dodgeville, who's been with us in previous sessions on this bill, and Travis Tranel from southwestern Wisconsin, who was with us last time. There were 3 Republicans who also co-sponsored it last time who aren't on board yet. I hope they jump back on board, and I hope there are more Republicans on board. I understand that there are a lot of Republicans who'd like to come on board this, or at least a couple handful, but the speaker doesn't want it to happen. And because of changes in our campaign finance law back in 2015, the speaker's got a huge chest of money right next to him that he can dip into and tell anyone who doesn't obey his little wishes that, if they want to be a hero on this bill, fine, but they're going to be primaried and they're going to be out of their job in less than 2 years. So that's the club he's got in his hand that he can beat over people's heads with.
Thanks, Matt. And Representative, we have another question. What are the chances there'll be a budget by the end of this fiscal year?
That's a phenomenal question. The chances are, I think, good. Honestly, the budget that's going to be crafted in joint finance is going to be problematic at best. And I do anticipate us having to finish out the year with the previous budget. But I think the governor's office is quite prepared on what their non-negotiables will be, and that he will sign one that is the most it won't be the people's budget, but I think it will be a budget that will be less harmful than what's going to come out of joint finance.
I suspect it will be a lot like it was 2 years ago. And that is, the Republicans are going to, when they finally turn the budget into Evers, it will be as little as bare bones verbally text as possible. So there's as few opportunities as possible for Evers to use the partial veto to try to rewrite legislation. That's pretty much what they did 2 years ago. And then Evers has to choose have I got enough here? Is there any point in, he's probably not going to veto the whole thing because he'll want to get whatever is good in that version and, partial veto as much as he can. But because there was a lot of speculation 2 years ago that there'll never be a budget because Evers and the legislature are so far apart, but it just turned out strategically that there was advantages for both of them to do what they did and, take a half a loaf if you're Evers or perhaps even less than that.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat right now. Hopefully people are fabricating those questions. Do you have any other comments that you'd like to add? We have about 12 to 10 minutes left.
Well, I was just wondering, just to follow up on that last question, I wanted to ask Representative Hong if she had heard whether there was any appetite on the governor's part to veto the whole thing, in part because he's getting all this federal money and would be able to run some programs anyway. It doesn't seem like that's his personality, though. And so I just wondered whether you've heard anything along those lines.
I have not at this time, but I do anticipate there going to be some really good use of the federal funding, the ARPA funding that's coming in. What was presented today in terms of the Badger Care expansion, in addition to ARPA funding, I think even with the allocation of those funds to really important programs like the Hmong Cultural Center, like the investment in the Black Historical Society, Black maternal health, mental health awareness, mental health services, there is going to be over, I think, 1.5 million left for the Republicans' precious rainy day fund. So I think, a full veto, I don't anticipate it, but I cannot speak for the governor.
Bruce, do you have any closing words you want to give us?
I was just going to say something about gerrymandering. There's probably no issue that I can't think of any issue urban Milwaukee has done more stories about. I mean, I think it's so damn important. And, I've always been looking for any fresh way to take this on and, just find ways to dramatize it. But I do think it's a hugely important issue, and so many things will depend upon that. So I guess I'm just hoping that we get a good result if this does go to the state Supreme Court.
Yeah, I'm kind of hopeful that we're going to have better maps this time around than certainly we got in 2011. Because if it goes to federal court, I think a panel of federal judges aren't just going to rubber stamp the Robin Voss rigging. And even if it goes to state courts, I don't know if, Hagedorn is not a reliable rubber stamp right now. And the People's Maps Commission has done so much work and will have an alternative map right there for them to consider. Not that they would take it, lock, stock, and barrel, but maybe they'll say, look, let's do something in between these two maps. And so I'm hoping we'll get a better result this time around. And then we've got to pass this bill somehow, or Representative Hesselbein's got a bill to amend the state constitution to give us independent nonpartisan redistricting. She introduced last time. I don't know if she's going to introduce it this time, but that's another way to go. And I just think, the people are behind us. We've seen that in the polls. We've seen that in the number of counties. We've seen that in the protests. We've seen that in petitions. We see it, the testimony at the People's Maps Commission. So at some point, if we've got a working democracy, and that's the big if, the legislators are going to have to come around on this issue.
Thanks, Matt. We did get 2 more questions during this response. And one of them reads, thoughts on the Wisconsin-based lawsuit on the $5 billion payments in the last stimulus for debt relief to Black farmers?
Well, I think it's long overdue because the way the Department of Agriculture has worked over the years has been discriminatory against Black farmers. And this is a small recompense that is necessary and will help people who need the help.
Thanks. We have another question. Any chance that the governor can leverage the some sufficient provisions of the school choice program?
think I need a little more detail on the question.
That's all this question gives us. Maybe they'd like to type up just a little bit more on that. We can wait, but that is basically our last question, I believe.
I don't know if Representative Hong has any information on that.
Yeah,
I don't. It's out of the grasp.
I'm not able to answer right now. I think whenever I see the words governor and leverage, I tend to take a step back in terms of what the administration decides. Yeah. But I did want to go back to the previous questions. I just put into the chat a project that my good friend Adrian Lipscomb up in La Crosse is working on for folks who are looking at projects that are looking to return land to Black farmers. 40 acres and a mule has been fundraising for the past year and a half now almost, but Adrienne out in La Crosse is doing some phenomenal work. She's a chef, but her background is in planning. So really interesting and very important project that I highly recommend folks check out.
Do you want to, Representative Hong, give us any last words of wisdom or inspiration before we close out?
I talked about co-opting messaging earlier, and I talked about the importance of organizing and that we really do need to work to bring people with us whenever we're talking about important issues. And I think that is a responsibility of any organizer and any elected. And in order to do that, we do truly have to listen to folks and try. And I know that I don't have a reputation of going in lightly, but I do believe that policy and change starts with conversation. And so I encourage everyone to continue to have important conversations, uncomfortable conversations. It's not just about, making sure our democracy survives, but it's also about democratizing discomfort, democratizing conversation, that we continue to elevate one another and demand more of electeds. But again, continue to have those conversations, especially uncomfortable ones, especially if you've got folks out in rural areas that may be very consumed by the type of media that they may be consuming, to continue to have those conversations and make sure that when Republicans use language like fiscal responsibility and being stewards of the taxpayer dollar, that you go to the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign to show them how all of those things are a lie.
Well, thanks very much, Representative Hong, for your words in the Q&A and for your talk, which was inspirational. And thanks, Bruce, for your talk and for your participation here and your kind comments about the work that we do here at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. It was a pleasure listening to both of you, and I filled half a notebook with notes from both of your talks. So I also want to thank Beverly Spear for all the legwork she's done in getting this event together, and Sally Flores for helping Beverly in prep for this event and for handling the Q&A, which went very smoothly. The whole program went smoothly, thanks to you two. Certainly no thanks to me. I can barely turn my computer on. So I want to thank all of the supporters of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, all the members of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign for supporting the vital work we do here. And I urge you all to stay involved in this effort to secure and expand our democracy in Wisconsin and in this country. I do believe what Representative Hong was saying is really important, that we need to listen to people in our state, and we need to have conversations with people who don't agree with us already. That's one of the essential ways that we're going to move this state and this country forward. So please take action and urge your legislators and the Republican leadership to support the bill to ban gerrymandering, and please urge your legislators and the Republican leadership not to go forward with the voter suppression bills. We have links on our website under reforms that can give you the information you need on these bills. And I'm sure there are some links in the chat there as well, because Beverly and Sally have been great in posting that stuff. We'll also be working on bills in the next couple months on campaign finance reform. So stay tuned for those. And we really appreciate your support. You keep us going. I look forward to seeing all of you in person at next year's annual meeting. Till then, take care. And together, let's keep making good trouble. Thanks very much and have a nice evening. It's great to see everybody.
Thank you so much. Good night, all.